People often equate the collapse of Terra's Luna and UST ecosystem to crypto's Lehman or Bear Stearns moment. But our next guest says it draws more parallels to the panic of 1907. What are the lessons we can learn from that panic? Joining us now to discuss is Francis Coppola, author of The Case for People's QE. Francis, great to have you on the show, and really cool article. You wrote this article for us for CoinDesk called Crypto's 1907 Moment. So maybe we could start off by talking about what happened in 1907 and who were the players involved.
Well, it was, in some respects, quite a typical market panic. We had a few very important but very interconnected people. So we had two brothers called Augustus and Otto Heinze, and we had their friend Charles Morse, who was a banker, and we had his friend Charles Barney, who ran the Knickerbocker Trust Company. And we had the financier John Pierpont Morgan, who founded what is now one of the biggest banks in the world, JP Morgan. And they all knew each other. They were all connected. And really, the whole story is one of people who all knew each other and all were connected and all doing business with each other, being caught out because one of them did something extremely stupid. And that was one of the Heinz brothers, who decided that speculators were shorting the stock of his company or borrowing it in order to short it. So he tried to corner the market. He borrowed heavily to buy his own stock in order to do a short squeeze. The only problem was the speculators weren't doing that at all. The stock was much more widely owned than he realized. And so the traders could all cover their positions, and the short squeeze failed, and he was bankrupted, along with his brother and his company, the United Copper Mining Company. It wasn't even a bank or a finance company, it was a mining company. Failed. And the problem with this was that because these guys were so connected to other people, the fact that they'd failed meant that there was contagion to other companies, and particularly to banks, the banks owned by Charles Morse, and then on to the trust companies, and particularly the Knickerbocker Trust Company, run by Charles Barney, who was suspected of having lent money to the Heinzes. So we had this collapse going on across the financial system because of a mistake made by one man, in effect. And it strikes me that this is quite similar to what went on with Terra Luna when, the one man made quite a catastrophic mistake, really, in creating a stablecoin that actually turned out not to be stable at all and had been warned about it, but went on anyway. And it all came to grief in the end. And it caused knock-on contagion to other companies with whom he'd been doing business, and the key players in this all knew each other. It's really quite similar, I think.
So in this scenario, you cast Do Kwon, the creator of Terra Luna, as the Charles Morse banker, and Sam Bankman-Fried, the CEO of FTX, as JP Morgan, the one who kind of decides who to bail out in this scenario. So it's not like the great financial crisis where we had the Federal Reserve. And in fact, you mentioned that the Federal Reserve System was kind of created out of this to prevent this kind of panic and to give some oversight to it. So, but back then it was an individual who kind of decided piecemeal based on his relationships on who to save and who not to. So in this case, save BlockFi, Voyager, but not Celsius.
Exactly that, yes. So if you look back to 1907, there was John Pierpont Morgan looking at the books of the Knickerbocker Trust Company and deciding that it was insolvent, and on that basis deciding not to bail it out. And that's extraordinarily similar to what Sam Bankman-Fried did with Celsius. One of the things that brought Celsius down actually was Sam Bankman-Fried saying, I found a big hole in its books. It's insolvent. While at the same time deciding the block fee was okay and bailing that one out. This kind of a big finance person with very deep pockets and very good connections, basically taking the role of lender of last resort to the financial system, or in the case of crypto, to the crypto system, has been a feature of financial systems in the past, and that seems to be what's happening in crypto now. And what happened, of course, in America in 1907 was there was then an inquiry by Congress who decided this wasn't a very good way of running things, really, and on that basis created the Federal Reserve System. So the reason why I've compared this to 1907 rather than to 2008 or even to 1929 is the fact that in both of those, the Federal Reserve existed and was a key player. You know, people can argue about the role that it played, and it's in 1929 its role in not doing enough, really, and allowing a depression to take hold, and perhaps in 2008 doing the opposite, doing too much, and setting up the problems we have now with inflation and so forth. We know we can debate that. But in both of those crises, the Federal Reserve, a government institution, and also governments themselves were key players. Whereas in 1907, it was very much an individual within the financial system who was responsible for backing everything up.
Frances, one could make the argument that the lack of assistance to Bear Stearns actually, in many ways mirrors what happened here with Celsius. But nonetheless, getting back to this whole idea of the creation of the Fed, that's not going to happen in crypto, one assumes, because of the very ethos of crypto is that it's decentralized. In other words, and also the impact, while it's severe in crypto, is not severe relative to the overall economy compared to other problems. That it is just a flea on the overall body of the economy. So what happens ultimately in crypto? There's no central bank that will ultimately be created. There's no outside of Sam Bankman-Fried. There's only so much capital he has, even if it does seem infinite. What happens ultimately? We hear this sort of ripple effect happening overall in the entire crypto economy, where companies are still losing money because of it. So yes. What next?
Well, that is what's going to happen, because I think if what we saw in 1907 was there was actually a rolling crisis. I've talked about the failure of United Copper and the knock-on effects to Morse's banks and then to the Knickerbocker Trust. But there were then further phases of the crisis. So John Pierpont Morgan had to step in again to bail out a whole load of brokerages and banks and trust companies that were exposed to the failure of a steel company. And it went on like that for some time, with this one man constantly having to step in to try and try and prop the whole thing up. I think the dilemma for crypto, as you say, there is no prospect of something like this, the Federal Reserve being created, and the chances of crypto as it is now causing the kind of disastrous economic effects that happened in 1907. It did cause a very deep recession and a lot of misery for a lot of people. It's not very likely that's going to happen from a crypto collapse. But we should bear in mind that crypto has been, over the last few years, tying itself rather closely to the traditional financial system. And so the question will be the extent to which problems in crypto feed into the traditional finance system, and whether that could force traditional central banks to step in. So far, there's no evidence that would happen. But what I think we will see is perhaps closer oversight and more regulation of the sector, because of the risk of that happening in the future.
Do you think, though, what would a crypto collapse look like? And have we seen the worst of it so far? Or do you think that it gets worse?
I do think it gets worse, yes. I've written about this previously, actually, that I think this crisis is different. We've seen bear markets in crypto before. We've seen really very dramatic collapses. We've seen Bitcoin lose 80% of its value in 2018, for example. And the failure, the collapse of Mt. Gox in 2014 had a similar effect. And crypto does eventually bounce back and then recovers its gains and goes on to greater things in each of those occasions. The reason why I think this is different is what I've said already about the Fed, that underpinning the entire crypto ecosystem is the dollar. The crypto people have tied themselves to the dollar. And really, you could say the whole of crypto has existed during a time of exceptional monetary looseness by central banks, and particularly by the Fed. Bitcoin emerged in the era of low interest rates and QE. That's where it came from in the first place. And it's never changed. That's what its paradigm has been for the whole of its existence. So how it will respond to a complete shift away from a low inflation, low interest rates QE paradigm, except monetary looseness paradigm, towards a high inflation, higher interest rates, monetary tightness paradigm in dollar markets, and indeed in traditional currency markets more generally, remains to be seen. So I think this time is different, and it will be interesting to see how long it takes crypto to recover, and indeed if it even does.
So Frances, just to round this out, talked such many complex topics here. What do you think is the main practical piece of advice from 1907 for either, the crypto industry or for policymakers? Like, how would you distill this into okay, we learned this is what you should do?
Well, I think the main thing I would say is that actually, as humans, we always put our trust in people. We think we trust tech, but actually it's always people. And I think the failure of Terra Luna and the fallout from that really shows the extent to which people trust people rather than the technology. So people trusted in Mashinsky, Celsius, and we saw in the way in which people, even after the crash, were saying, "Well, Mashinsky will save us. He's a good guy. He'll give us our money back," and so forth. And yet, this is going to go through very painful court cases. And my view is that people aren't going to get their money back. So it's really that kind of breakdown of trust in people. So my advice would be that you think very carefully before you pin your entire hopes, and perhaps more importantly your savings, on the good offices and trustworthiness of a single individual.
So, Frances, if you were on here about a year ago, you would have said that Tether was going to be the source of a collapse due to a stable coin. That doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, it seems as if Tether has moved its assets out of commercial paper. They recently announced that they no longer hold commercial paper. Do you think that there is still a problem there, or have you gained? Have they gained your trust yet?
My view on Tether has long been actually that I'm a little puzzled by this, because I don't think I did ever say it would be the source of a major collapse. My view was that as long as people had found a use for it, then they would continue to use it. My concern was that if there was a run on Tether, it would play out through the exchanges, and we would see failure of exchanges, not failure of Tether. Now, that hasn't happened, and that's a good thing, and I don't in the least mind being wrong about things like that. And it is fair to say that Tether has changed the composition of its assets. There's still less transparency than I would like, and I don't see why things like Tether should not be held to the same auditing standards as major banks are. I don't see why they shouldn't produce financials in the same way that banks do and be regulated in the same way that banks are. I can't see any reason why that should not be the case. But then that's generally my view of cryptocurrency and fintech more widely, that I think this idea that we shouldn't regulate things that do bank-like things in the same way that we do banks is, I think, misguided and mistaken. The regulations we have around banks exist for a reason, and that is primarily to protect consumers. and actually protecting consumers is important. And I realise that in crypto, it's always been caveat emptor, Wild West. You take responsibility for your own savings, but we do have power asymmetries and information asymmetries even in crypto. It's not as transparent as it really should be. So you either go for major transparency, in which case you're going to have to enforce it one way or another, because companies like crypto banks will act in an opaque way if they can. And we have seen how in the course of the failures of things like Voyager and Celsius, just how opaque they can be, and 3AC, just how opaque these things can be, and how little we know about what they're actually doing with people's money. Mm-hmm. And when that's the case, you need more regulation than the crypto world really wants to have. So for me, it boils down to that. You either put your money where your mouth and say, okay, we're going to have caveat emptor, but we're going to make sure everything's transparent so people really do have the information that they need. Or you have regulation to protect people who don't have the information that they need and have no way of getting it.
All right, we'll leave it there. Folks, check out Frances's article, Crypto's 1907 Moment, on CoinDesk.com for more from Frances. Thank you so much. That was Frances Coppola.